From the moment Naomi Carter stepped into the grand halls of the courthouse, she felt the weight of 1,000 silent judgments pressing down on her. It was a sensation she had learned to live with, the hushed whispers that trailed her, the skeptical glances from those who assumed too much and understood too little. But today was different. Today, the hostility was unspoken yet suffocating, a thick fog of prejudice hanging in the air. She could feel the stares piercing into her from the gallery, where spectators sat with a mixture of curiosity and quiet disdain. Rumors had already spread. The black woman standing trial was accused of obstructing the police, of resisting arrest, an all too familiar accusation used against people who dared to question authority. At the plaintiff's table, 2 uniformed officers sat with smug confidence. Officer Brent Lawson leaned back in his chair, his mustache twitching with barely concealed amusement. Beside him, Officer Daniel Grayson adjusted his collar, his thick arms crossed as if he had already won. They had played this game before, using their badges as shields, their reports as weapons, and the system as their accomplice. Above them, presiding over the courtroom, sat Judge Raymond Caldwell, a man known for his unwavering support of law enforcement, no matter the case. With his deep-set eyes and permanent scowl, he projected an air of authority that warned defense attorneys not to waste his time. He cleared his throat and prepared to address the court. But what no one in that room knew, what neither the officers, the spectators, nor even the judge suspected, was that Naomi Carter was holding back a devastating truth. She was not just another black woman being railroaded by the system. She was a United States attorney. And she had no intention of going down without a fight. Naomi's morning had begun like any other. She woke before the sun rose, the faint sounds of traffic filtering through her apartment in Bronxwood, just a few blocks from Gun Hill Road and White Plains Avenue. The rhythm of the city had always been a comfort to her, an unspoken promise that life never stood still, that progress never ceased. She moved through her morning routine with practiced ease. A quick shower, a pressed navy blouse paired with tailored slacks, and a steaming cup of coffee that she cradled between her hands as she glanced over the day's schedule. Her job at the Department of Justice came with an unrelenting workload, but she thrived in the chaos. Today's agenda was packed: motions to file, case briefs to review, and a pending legal matter that required her attention in Jamaica, Queens. She had originally planned to take the subway to work, a habit born out of efficiency rather than necessity. But today, something nudged her toward taking her car instead. Maybe it was the need for flexibility, or maybe it was just instinct. Either way, as she weaved through morning traffic, the smooth notes of an R&B classic played through her speakers, offering a brief moment of peace. That peace shattered the moment she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. A police cruiser was tailing her, red and blue lights reflecting off the surrounding buildings in an ominous dance of authority. Her breath hitched. She had done nothing wrong. And yet, she knew that didn't matter. With a steadying exhale, she signaled and pulled over to the curb, her heartbeat thudding against her ribs. Naomi was no stranger to these situations. She had spent years prosecuting cases of police misconduct, reading testimony after testimony from those who had suffered similar fates. She knew the standard protocol: keep your hands visible, remain calm, comply. But she also knew that sometimes none of that mattered. Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel as she watched in the side mirror. 2 officers stepped out of the vehicle. Officer Brent Lawson was the first to approach, his lanky frame moving with a deliberate arrogance. His mustache twitched slightly, and his pale eyes carried an expression Naomi had seen before, the look of someone who believed they had all the power. Behind him, Officer Daniel Grayson followed, bulkier, his face already tinged red with either irritation or the morning chill. Naomi forced a neutral expression as she lowered her window. "Good morning, officers. How can I help you?" Lawson barely looked at her, his tone clipped. "License, registration, and proof of insurance." Naomi moved carefully, retrieving the documents from her glove compartment and handing them over. "May I ask why I was stopped?" Lawson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he exchanged a glance with Grayson, who smirked slightly before leaning closer, his gaze flickering across the interior of her car as if searching for something, anything, to justify what was about to come next. You were speeding, Lawson finally said, doing 45 in a 30. Naomi's brows knitted slightly. She knew that wasn't true. She had been hyper-aware of her speed, cautious of pedestrians and cyclists in the busy neighborhood. But she also knew better than to argue outright. She took a slow breath, keeping her voice even. Officer, I believe I was under the limit. Is there a chance you clocked the wrong car? Grayson scoffed, rolling his eyes. I don't make mistakes with my radar gun. Listen, lady, are you going to give us a problem? A slow coil of frustration wrapped around Naomi's spine. She was used to subtle microaggressions, the way authority figures often dismissed her intelligence, but there was something different about this encounter. Something calculated. I'm not trying to cause any trouble, she said carefully. I'm simply asking for clarification. Lawson's lips curled into a slow, taunting sneer. Naomi recognized that look. It was the look of a man who thought he had control over her. The look of a man who believed she had no power. But what he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that Naomi Carter was not someone who could be intimidated. And before this was over, they were going to learn that the hard way. Officer Brent Lawson took a step back, his gaze flicking to Officer Daniel Grayson as the two exchanged hushed words. Though their voices were low, Naomi Carter caught snatches of their conversation. Attitude, these people. Her jaw clenched. She had heard enough coded language in her lifetime to recognize it instantly. It was the same dismissive rhetoric used by those who saw people like her as nothing more than problems to control. A sharp spark of anger ignited in her chest, but she forced herself to remain composed. Then Lawson turned back toward her, his posture rigid with authority. Step out of the car, he ordered. We need to do a quick search. Naomi's heartbeat quickened. A search? For what reason? She steadied her voice. Officer, on what grounds? I haven't consented, and you don't have probable cause. Grayson let out an exaggerated sigh, stepping forward again. Are you resisting, ma'am? His voice carried the unmistakable weight of a threat, as if challenging her to push back so they could justify escalation. Naomi inhaled deeply, forcing the anger bubbling inside her to settle. I'm not resisting, she said evenly. I'm just asking for an explanation. That's my right. The tension thickened between them. Then, without warning, Lawson reached for the door handle and yanked it open. Get out of the car. Now. Naomi exhaled sharply, realizing there was no point in pushing further. Not yet. She slowly stepped out, making sure her hands were visible, the way she had been taught since she was old enough to understand the dangers of not doing so. Pedestrians on the sidewalk had begun to slow, their heads turning toward the scene. Naomi caught glimpses of curious stares, some laced with concern, others frozen in uncertainty. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone was raised, its camera lens capturing everything. She set her jaw. If these officers wanted to make a spectacle out of this, she would let them, but only to a point. Grayson moved in first, his large hands patting her down with a roughness that made her skin crawl. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to endure it. Meanwhile, Lawson rummaged through the back seat of her car, yanking open compartments, searching for something, anything, to justify what they were doing. Naomi had never felt so violated. Every time she attempted to speak, Grayson snapped at her to stay quiet. She complied, not out of submission, but out of strategy. Because she wasn't just another citizen on the street. She was a United States attorney in the making. Someone who had spent years studying the very laws these men were now breaking. She knew what they were doing was illegal. She knew that without probable cause or a warrant, their search was unconstitutional. And more than anything, she knew that in a single phone call she could initiate an investigation that would shake their entire precinct. But Naomi held her cards close. She wasn't ready to reveal her hand just yet. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Lawson slammed the car door shut. His expression was taut with frustration. There's nothing here, he muttered. Grayson huffed, adjusting his belt. Just write her up for speeding, he added, then smirked. Maybe resisting an officer, too. Naomi's eyes snapped up. Resisting? Her voice was sharp, disbelieving. I cooperated fully. Grayson's smirk widened. We'll see what the report says. Naomi's fingers curled into fists at her sides. They thought they could twist this situation to suit their narrative. They thought she would be just another case file, another uncontested report. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She said nothing as the officers handed her a summons for speeding, along with a veiled threat of additional charges. She took the paper with steady hands, though beneath the surface something inside her burned. As she watched the patrol car pull away, leaving her standing on the sidewalk, Naomi felt a tremor course through her body. But it wasn't fear. It was rage. Not the reckless kind of rage that led to impulsive action. No, this was something deeper, a focused, blazing fury that demanded justice. For years, she had carefully constructed a shield, one built from patience, pride, dignity, and unwavering resolve. And now, it was time to use it. Long before she had the power to prosecute cases, before she had even stepped foot in law school, Naomi Carter had been a young girl growing up in the heart of Bronxwood. Her parents, David and Lillian Carter, had instilled in her a deep sense of justice from the time she was old enough to listen. Her father, a history professor at Hudson University, specialized in African American studies. He spoke of the resilience of those who had come before them, of the marches in Selma, of the sit-ins, of the unbreakable spirit that had fueled generations of fighters. Her mother was a social worker, advocating for low-income families in their community. She spent her days helping the people society often overlooked, teaching Naomi that real change didn't happen in grand, sweeping gestures. It happened one fight at a time. Their dinner table conversations weren't about mundane topics like school gossip or television shows. They were about injustice, about systemic oppression, about what it meant to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. And Naomi had listened. She had absorbed every lesson, every story. And then, at just 9 years old, she had experienced the reality of injustice for the first time. Her uncle had been stopped by the police outside a convenience store. Naomi had been with him, clutching a bottle of soda in her small hands as she watched the scene unfold. She didn't fully understand what was happening at the time, only that her uncle, a kind and patient man, was suddenly being shoved against a wall, frisked like a criminal. She had seen the anger in his eyes, the way his jaw clenched, but he didn't fight back. Because he knew. Because every black man knew. She had stood there, helpless, her heart pounding, her small hands trembling as she watched a grown man, a man she admired, forced to silently endure humiliation. It was the moment that changed everything for her. She had gone home that night and told her parents through angry, tear-streaked sobs that she never wanted to feel that powerless again. Her father had knelt in front of her, his strong hands on her shoulders, and said, "Then you fight, Naomi. You fight with your mind, with the law, with everything they don't expect you to have." And she had. All through high school, she dominated debate club, her sharp mind earning her a reputation as someone who never cracked under pressure. She volunteered at a community legal aid office, watching lawyers wield the law as both a sword and a shield. One attorney, Diana Maxwell, had taken her under her wing, mentoring her, guiding her. "Empathy, Naomi," she had always said. "You can know the law inside and out, but if you don't have empathy, you're just another cog in the system." That lesson had shaped her. She had carried it with her through Columbia University, through New York School of Law, through every long night of studying, every exhausting case file, every moment where she wondered if the fight was worth it. And now, standing on a cold sidewalk, a summons in her hand and an unjust charge hanging over her head, she knew one thing for certain. The fight had just begun. Empathy, Naomi. Without it, you're just another cog in a broken system. The words echoed in Naomi Carter's mind, spoken by her former mentor, Diana Maxwell, the woman who had taught her that law wasn't just about rules and procedures, it was about people. Naomi had been just a teenager when she first walked into Maxwell & Associates, a small but respected legal aid firm in Bronxwood. She had started with simple tasks, filing paperwork, sorting legal briefs, but Diana had recognized something in her. A sharp mind, a quiet fire, a desire to understand the law, not just study it. Diana had taken her under her wing, teaching her how to break down legal arguments, how to dissect cases, how to find the human story buried in every court document. "Empathy is what separates the good lawyers from the great ones," Diana had told her once, leaning back in her chair, eyes full of wisdom. "You can know every statute, every precedent, but if you can't understand the people behind them, you'll be no better than those who use the law to oppress instead of protect." Those words had stayed with Naomi. They had guided her as she pursued her education at Columbia University, where she double majored in political science and African American studies. Her college years had been a battleground of ideas. She had found herself in classrooms where systemic racism was debated like an abstract concept, where statistics were thrown around without any understanding of the real lives behind those numbers. Naomi, however, didn't just rely on theory. She spoke from experience. She had grown up seeing how the system failed people who looked like her. She had watched injustices play out in her own neighborhood. She had felt, firsthand, the way power could be abused by those meant to uphold the law. By the time she graduated with high honors, she had one goal: to fight from within the system itself. She went on to New York School of Law, where she threw herself into the work. Her studies were relentless, but she thrived under the pressure. She earned a coveted clerkship at the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, where she worked under judges who handled civil rights cases, gaining an even deeper understanding of how the law could be both a sword and a shield. It was no surprise when she was offered a position at the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. For Naomi, it felt like destiny. She had spent years studying the law. Now she would wield it. But what she hadn't expected, what she hadn't fully prepared for, was to find herself on the opposite side of that system. To become the case instead of the lawyer arguing it. Naomi stared at the summons on her kitchen table. It felt heavier than just a piece of paper. It felt like a symbol of every injustice she had ever fought against. The smell of fresh coffee still lingered in the air, but her appetite had long since vanished. Her fingers hovered over the document, the absurdity of it gnawing at her. A speeding ticket. Possible resisting arrest. She almost laughed at the audacity. She had done nothing but ask why she was being stopped. Nothing but assert her rights, rights she had dedicated her entire career to upholding. And for that, she had been treated like a criminal. Her anger wasn't the kind that burned out quickly. It was the kind that simmered, the kind that settled deep in the bones, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. And Naomi Carter had never been one to walk away from a fight. She pulled her laptop toward her and opened a blank document. If they wanted a fight, she would give them one. But she would fight it the way she had been trained, with precision, with patience, and with an unshakable resolve. Her fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard as she began documenting everything. The exact time and location of the traffic stop. The demeanor of Officers Brent Lawson and Daniel Grayson. Their sneering remarks. Their bullying tactics. Their blatant threat to add bogus charges. Every detail mattered, because this wasn't just a ticket, it was evidence. When she finished, she sat back, exhaling through her nose. Then, without hesitation, she picked up her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. After 2 rings, Marcus Ellis answered. "Naomi?" His voice was sharp, alert. "We need to talk," she said, skipping the pleasantries. A beat of silence. "Then what happened?" She didn't waste time with details he didn't need yet, just the facts. The stop, the bogus accusation, the illegal search. When she finished, Marcus let out a low breath. "They really tried to charge you with resisting?" "They tried," Naomi corrected. "We'll see if they actually file it." Marcus cursed under his breath. He was a brilliant litigator, currently working in another branch of the DOJ, and he had dedicated his career to exposing police misconduct. If anyone would know how to play this the right way, it was him. "What do you want to do?" he asked finally. "Wait," Naomi said. "I want to see if they push this further. If they do, then we go straight for their throats." Marcus was silent for a moment. Then, in a low, dangerous voice, he said, "They have no idea who they just messed with." Naomi smiled. "No, they don't. Meet me for lunch tomorrow," he said. "Rose's Cafe, noon. We'll figure out our next steps." She agreed and hung up. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, she locked her notes inside her home safe. Tomorrow, she would take the first step toward justice. Morning sunlight filtered through her apartment windows, casting long shadows over her living room. Naomi sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She wasn't afraid, but there was a weight on her chest, a gnawing unease that came from knowing she was about to challenge the very system she worked within. She had spent her career preparing cases against corrupt officers. Now, she would be the case. But she wouldn't go down easily. She showered, letting the scalding water ground her. Then she dressed with purpose, a crisp navy suit, a neatly pressed blouse, a composed expression that revealed nothing. She tucked her documents into her briefcase, checked her phone for Marcus's confirmation, then locked her apartment door behind her. This time, she took the subway instead of driving. She wasn't going to give them another excuse to pull her over. As she passed through security at the Department of Justice, she forced a small, professional smile at the guards, slipping seamlessly into her usual routine. But her mind was already somewhere else. Because soon, her world was going to change. And when it did, she would make damn sure she was ready. Naomi Carter stepped into the bustling cafe, clutching the summons in a crisp envelope tucked securely under her arm. On the outside, she wore the same composed, confident expression she always did. But inside, she was bracing herself. This wasn't just another legal battle. This was personal. Across the cafe, Marcus Ellis stood from his seat, giving her a nod of acknowledgement. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a warmth in his smile that usually put people at ease. But today, that warmth was absent. His expression was tight, his eyes scanning her face as she approached. "Are you okay?" he asked as soon as she sat down. Naomi let out a short breath. "I will be." They ordered coffee and sandwiches, then took a corner table by the window, where the distant hum of midday traffic filtered through the glass. Naomi set the summons down, flattening it with her fingertips, before recounting everything. The flashing lights in her rearview mirror, the officer's smirks, the illegal search, the humiliating pat-down, and the blatant undertones of racism in their words and actions. Marcus listened intently, his brows furrowed, hands folded tightly together on the table. When she finished, he exhaled sharply. "These guys have no idea who they're dealing with." His voice was quiet, but there was a sharp edge to it. Then he shook his head. "But it's bigger than that, Naomi. This is exactly what we talk about all the time, abuse of power disguised as law enforcement." Naomi nodded, gripping her coffee cup. "I'm worried they'll escalate," she admitted. "They mentioned resisting arrest. If they actually file that charge, even if I fight it and win, it could damage my reputation." She looked out the window, watching a woman walk by pushing a stroller. "But it's not just about me, Marcus. If they're willing to do this to me, someone who knows the law inside and out, imagine what they do to people who don't stand a chance." Marcus's expression darkened. "Exactly. We need to be strategic." He tapped his fingers against the table, thinking, "Are you reporting this to Internal Affairs, or are we taking it straight to the Civil Rights Division?" "I'm thinking both," Naomi said, drumming a pen against the table. "I can also file a formal complaint through the Civilian Complaint Review Board, but first, I want to see if they actually file charges. If they do." She set the pen down firmly. "I'll reveal who I am in court if necessary." Marcus hesitated. That would be a bombshell, but Naomi, be careful. Some judges hate surprises in their courtroom, and if the judge is in on this, well, you said these officers are known for intimidation. Maybe they have connections. Naomi's jaw tightened. "I'll handle it." Marcus gave her a long, measured look. "What's your next move?" "I need evidence," she said without hesitation. "There were people watching. Someone must have recorded it. I'm going to track down any videos and witness statements." Marcus nodded. "Smart. Let me know if you need anything." Naomi gave him a grateful look. She had always been selective with who she trusted, and Marcus Ellis had proven himself time and again. Finishing their coffee, they parted ways, but Naomi wasn't done for the day. She had work to do. Back at her office, Naomi closed the door and immediately pulled up social media. She combed through hashtags, local community pages, and neighborhood forums, looking for any mention of her traffic stop. Then, she found it, a short video clip on Twitter. The footage was shaky, taken from across the street, but it was clear enough. It showed Officer Daniel Grayson aggressively shoving her against her car while Officer Brent Lawson rummaged through her back seat. Naomi appeared calm, completely compliant. No resistance, no aggression. Nothing to justify their treatment of her. Her pulse quickened as she hit download, carefully saving the video and documenting the exact source. This was proof. She had barely finished labeling the file when her phone rang. Unknown number. Naomi hesitated. A voice in her head told her not to answer, But another voice, one honed by instinct, told her this wasn't a coincidence. She exhaled and picked up. Hello? For a moment, silence crackled on the other end. Then, a gruff voice spoke. Miss Carter. Naomi's pulse jumped. Yes, she said, her voice steady. This is Detective Brian Costello, NYPD Internal Affairs. I received a message from Marcus Ellis regarding an incident involving 2 officers, Brent Lawson and Daniel Grayson. I'd like to meet with you. Naomi sat up straighter. She hadn't expected Internal Affairs to respond this quickly. It was a small glimmer of hope. Someone inside the system was at least willing to listen. Of course, Detective, she said. When's good for you? Costello's voice was all business. Tomorrow morning. NYPD headquarters. Small conference room. I'll be there. She ended the call and set her phone down. It was a step in the right direction, but she wasn't prepared for what came next. That evening, Naomi stood at her kitchen counter, chopping vegetables for dinner. Her mind replayed the conversation with Detective Costello, running through potential angles. What questions he might ask, what information he might already have. Then her phone rang again. NYPD desk officer. She frowned and answered. Miss Carter? Yes. This is Officer Klein, NYPD. I'm calling to inform you that there is now a warrant for your arrest on charges of resisting arrest and obstruction. You are required to report to the 78th Precinct immediately, or additional penalties may apply. For a second, the world tilted. Her stomach clenched. She gripped the counter, nearly dropping the knife from her hand. They actually did it. They had twisted the story. They were trying to trap her. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She had been ready for intimidation, for pushback. But this? A warrant? They were trying to stain her record. Trying to make sure that before she could fight back, they dragged her through the system first. For a moment, sheer rage threatened to take over. Then she inhaled slowly. She remembered who she was. She wasn't just any defendant walking into a precinct. She was an assistant U.S. attorney. She was not powerless. Her hands clenched into fists. If they thought this would make her back down, they were wrong. She was going to walk into that precinct, and when she did, she would make sure they regretted every second of what they had just done. Naomi Carter sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel, the warrant for her own arrest still fresh in her mind. For the briefest moment, despair threatened to take hold. They were trying to break her. Trying to turn her into the villain before she could expose what they had done. But she wasn't alone in this. And she had the most powerful weapon on her side. The truth. She grabbed her keys, her documents, and her fully charged phone, then stepped out of the car. Her heels clicked against the pavement with purpose as she marched toward the 78th Precinct. She had no intention of hiding. She would confront this head-on. By the time she arrived, night had settled over Bronxwood, and the precinct's cold brick exterior loomed beneath flickering streetlights. The building had always carried a presence, but tonight it felt different. Not just a police station, a battleground. Naomi took a moment to steady herself, her mind running through legal statutes like a checklist. She knew exactly what they were trying to do. She knew exactly what her rights were, and she refused to let them intimidate her. With a controlled breath, she pushed through the station doors. The second she stepped inside, she was hit with the familiar stale stench of sweat and old coffee. Officers milled about, some flipping through paperwork, others laughing casually. But the moment she approached the front desk, the energy shifted. Heads turned. The murmurs started. A woman walking in on her own over an arrest warrant was not something they saw every day. The desk sergeant, a graying man with tired eyes, looked up at her. She spoke before he could. I'm here regarding a warrant in my name. For a second he blinked, clearly not expecting the subject of an active warrant to show up calmly and voluntarily. Then he sighed and nodded. Wait here. Naomi turned and sat in a hard plastic chair beneath the buzz of a flickering fluorescent light, ignoring the glares and whispers from some of the nearby officers. She didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. She had been in countless courtrooms before. She had gone up against powerful men who thought they were untouchable. She would not let them see her break. After 30 agonizing minutes, a young officer finally approached. Come with me. He led her down a dimly lit hallway through a series of doors until they reached a small, windowless interrogation room. The cinder block walls were off-white, the air thick with a stale, suffocating silence. Naomi sat down, setting her documents on the metal table, her heartbeat steady but alert. She didn't have to wait long. The door opened, and in stepped Detective Brian Costello. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed beard. His gaze was sharp, assessing. Naomi immediately recognized his voice from the phone call. He gave her a nod, somewhere between professional courtesy and quiet sympathy. "Miss Carter," he said, "thank you for coming in." She gave a small nod in return. "I understand there's a warrant for my arrest." Costello exhaled and pulled out a file. "Yes, but I also spoke with Marcus Ellis." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "He says you have information that might clear this up." Without missing a beat, Naomi slid the summons, a USB drive, and her handwritten notes across the table. Costello took them, scanning the documents. He inserted the USB into his laptop and played the Twitter video Naomi had found earlier. It wasn't long, but it was clear. It showed Officer Daniel Grayson pushing Naomi against her car, while Officer Brent Lawson searched the vehicle without cause. Naomi remained calm, compliant, no sign of resistance, no aggression. Costello frowned. "They claim you resisted," he murmured, scratching his chin. "Tried to flee, verbally threatened them." Naomi didn't blink. "That's a lie." She tapped the USB. "That clip shows exactly what happened. If anything, they were the aggressors." Costello let out a slow breath. "I'm not the judge here," he said carefully. "But I can already tell there's more to this than meets the eye." He leaned back, folding his arms. "For formality's sake, we have to process you," he admitted. "But I'll keep it discreet. Then we can start a full investigation. I'll speak with the district attorney's office and ask them to hold off on pressing charges until we've reviewed everything." Naomi's stomach tightened at the thought of being processed like a criminal. But she knew the protocol. She had prepared for this. She gave a slow nod. "All right." Costello led her through a series of hallways, away from prying eyes, doing his best to keep the process low profile. Still, nothing could erase the burning humiliation she felt as her fingerprints were taken, as she stood before a camera for her mugshot, as she, a federal prosecutor with an unblemished record, was treated as if she were some repeat offender. Naomi forced herself to breathe. This was temporary, and she would not let them break her. After what felt like an eternity, Costello returned her belongings and led her into a quieter office. "All right," he said, pulling out a notepad. "Tell me everything." Naomi didn't hesitate. She recounted it all. The flashing lights, the sneering remarks, the illegal search. Costello wrote everything down, his brows drawing together in concentration. "I'll need to interview them separately," he said finally. "But let's be clear. If they claimed you resisted, and you have video evidence to the contrary, this could be a serious case of falsified reports." Naomi's voice was calm, but the steel was unmistakable. "This isn't just about me." She met his gaze. "If they did it to me, they've done it to others, people who didn't have the resources to fight back." Costello was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I understand," he said. "I'll do my part. But keep in mind, this precinct, it closes ranks. Not everyone's going to be happy I'm looking into this." Naomi nodded. "I expected as much." She stood, smoothing out her blazer. "Thank you for your honesty, Detective." By the time she walked out of the precinct, the humiliation still lingered, but so did something else. A fire. Because tonight had proven something. They were willing to lie, willing to weaponize the system against her. And that meant there was so much more at stake than just her own reputation. This was bigger than her, and she wasn't going to stop until she exposed it all. Naomi Carter sat awake in the early hours of the morning, staring at the ceiling, exhaustion pressing down on her. Her mind wouldn't stop racing. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the cold, fluorescent lights of the precinct. She heard the sharp click of the fingerprint scanner, the sterile voice ordering her to turn her head for the mugshot camera flash. She had spent her career prosecuting criminals, not standing in their place. The unfamiliarity of it all, the sense of powerlessness, the weight of a system stacked against her, was something she had always known others endured. Now she was feeling it firsthand. But she wasn't broken. She lay still, breathing in the silence of her apartment, letting one thought circle through her mind. Let them see me in court. Let them see who I really am. And when that moment comes, I will not hold back. The summons and arrest warrant required Naomi to appear in criminal court in just 1 week. She didn't waste any time. Despite being a federal prosecutor, she hired a private defense attorney. A bitter irony, given how many cases she had argued from the other side. She needed someone ruthless, someone who had spent years fighting against wrongful arrests and holding law enforcement accountable. She chose Stella Morano. Stella was a force of nature, a civil rights lawyer with a reputation for going head-to-head with NYPD and winning. She had sharp eyes, a voice that commanded a courtroom, and a strategy that left opposing counsel scrambling. "I've seen cases like yours before," Stella told her as they sat in Naomi's apartment, reviewing the evidence. "But the fact that they doubled down and actually filed charges? That tells me something." Naomi sipped her coffee. "What?" Stella's lips pressed together. "They want to make an example out of you." Naomi's jaw tightened. "Then they chose the wrong person." Stella smirked. "Damn right they did." Naomi dressed meticulously that morning. A charcoal gray skirt suit, perfectly pressed. Her hair neatly pinned at the nape of her neck, not a strand out of place. Her demeanor was controlled, but inside, her rage simmered. She refused to walk into that courtroom looking frazzled or intimidated. She would hold her head high. Stella arrived at her apartment in a black sedan, and together they drove through the bustling streets of downtown Bronxwood toward the Bronx County Criminal Court. Inside, the courthouse was alive with chaos. Lawyers rushing past with thick case files, defendants pacing anxiously, police officers standing with arms crossed in corners. Naomi knew this world well. But today, she wasn't the prosecutor. Today, she was the accused. Her pulse quickened as she stepped into the courtroom. And there they were. Sitting in the front row, wearing crisp uniforms, were Officer Brent Lawson and Officer Daniel Grayson. Their expressions were smug, their postures relaxed, as if they had already won. Sitting beside them was their attorney, Assistant District Attorney Caroline Whitaker. Naomi had dealt with Whitaker before. She was a fierce prosecutor, known for protecting the police at all costs. Naomi watched as Whitaker leaned over to the officers and muttered something. Grayson snickered. Naomi swallowed her anger. She could hear her father's voice in her mind. "Never lose your cool in the face of injustice. That's when they have power over you." She inhaled deeply. She would not give them that power. The courtroom quieted as the clerk called Naomi's case. She and Stella stepped forward to the defense table. Judge Raymond Caldwell sat at the bench, flipping through Naomi's file with an impassive expression. Naomi had read about him, a judge known for siding with law enforcement. Complaints of racial bias had been whispered about in legal circles, but never proven. This was going to be an uphill battle. Caroline Whitaker stood first, stepping to the podium. Her tone was measured, confident. "Your Honor, the defendant is charged with resisting arrest, obstruction of governmental administration, and disorderly conduct. During a lawful traffic stop, she became belligerent, refused to comply with the officer's instructions, and even attempted to flee." At that last statement, Naomi nearly laughed, but she held her expression neutral. Beside her, Stella placed a steady hand on her arm, a silent reminder to stay composed. Whitaker continued, "The officers involved have clean records. The official police report states the defendant was uncooperative and combative. We have no reason to doubt their testimony." Naomi felt her fists clench beneath the table. Lies. Every word was a lie. When Whitaker finished, Stella stood. Her tone was calm but resonant, the voice of a woman who had fought this battle before and won. "Your Honor, my client categorically denies these charges." She gestured toward Naomi. "Miss Carter not only complied fully, but was subjected to an improper search and humiliating treatment." Judge Caldwell peered at her over his reading glasses. "Do you have evidence to support this claim?" Stella's lips curved slightly. "We do." She pulled a USB from her briefcase. "This is video footage of the stop, recorded by a bystander and posted publicly online." Caldwell's expression barely changed, but Naomi saw his fingers tighten around his pen. Whitaker immediately interjected. "Your Honor, I'd caution against relying on shaky cell phone videos. There's no guarantee of authenticity." Naomi almost rolled her eyes. Typical. Stella didn't flinch. "We have the original file, and we're prepared to authenticate it." Judge Caldwell exhaled, looking at the evidence. "I'll allow the video," he said finally, "but it must be verified." For now, he turned his attention back to Naomi. Miss Carter, how do you plead? Before Naomi could open her mouth, Stella spoke first. Not guilty, Your Honor. A hush fell over the courtroom. Judge Caldwell made a note in his file. Very well. We'll schedule a preliminary hearing to review the evidence. He closed the folder with a snap. This court is adjourned. As Naomi turned to leave, her eyes locked with Officer Lawson's. He smirked. Grayson leaned in, whispering something, amusement flickering across his face. Naomi didn't need to hear the words to know what he had said. They still thought they owned the narrative. Still thought they had power over her. Naomi lifted her chin and turned away. They had tried to frame her, tried to bury her in false charges, but they had underestimated who they were up against. She was not afraid. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was just the beginning. Judge Raymond Caldwell looked up at Naomi Carter for the first time, his gaze lingering just a little too long. Naomi felt a chill creep down her spine, not of fear but of something unsettling, as though he was assessing more than just her posture. Then, in an even, dispassionate voice, he said, "Bail is set at $55,000. He barely glanced up before moving on to the next case. Naomi's cheeks burned with indignation. $55,000? For a fabricated charge? She knew how these hearings worked. Low-level offenses rarely received bail this high, unless the judge wanted to send a message. Stella was already prepared, moving swiftly to arrange payment before Naomi could even fully process her outrage. As Naomi turned to leave, she caught Officer Brent Lawson's gaze. His smirk was slow, deliberate. His lips moved in a whisper she couldn't quite make out. But she didn't need to hear the words to understand the meaning. Contempt, arrogance, certainty that he would win. Naomi forced herself to turn away. She wouldn't let him see her anger. She wouldn't give him that power. Out in the hallway, Stella led her to a nearby bench. This is going to be an uphill battle with Caldwell on the bench, she sighed, rubbing her temple. And that DA, Caroline Whitaker, she's got a reputation for protecting police at all costs. Naomi stared at the drab courthouse walls, her mind racing. I'm not backing down, she said finally, her voice steely. She turned to Stella. I need to talk to the Civil Rights Division. This could turn into a federal case. Stella studied her. I agree, but the moment you reveal your DOJ position, everything changes. Are you sure you want to tip your hand so soon? Naomi hesitated, considering. Not yet. If she played that card too early, they would have time to maneuver around it. I need more evidence first, she said. More insight into these officers' track records. And if Caldwell tries to railroad this case, we'll push to move it to federal court. Stella nodded. Then we build our case, quietly but aggressively. They parted ways after setting a strategy meeting, and Naomi stepped out into the bustling street. The wind hit her face, sharp and cold, but she welcomed it. It reminded her of one thing. She was still free, and she was still fighting. She pulled out her phone and dialed Marcus Ellis. We need to move fast, she told him. Naomi threw herself into gathering evidence. She and Stella worked methodically, using Naomi's insider knowledge of how prosecutors operated to build a meticulous defense strategy. During her late-night hours, she pored over case law, scoured previous complaints against officers Brent Lawson and Daniel Grayson, and analyzed the 78th Precinct's record of misconduct allegations. The deeper she dug, the worse it got. Marcus put her in touch with Samira Green, a staff attorney at the New York Civil Liberties Union, who specialized in police accountability. They met at a small diner in the Bronx, tucked into a booth where the smell of coffee and fried eggs lingered in the air. Naomi laid out the details of her case. Samira listened, nodding, before sliding a thick file across the table. You're not the first, she said grimly. Naomi flipped through the pages, her heart pounding. 3 prior complaints, all against Lawson and Grayson, all involving Black or Latino motorists, all dismissed. Naomi scanned the documents, her breath growing shallow. Patterns. So many patterns. Unlawful searches, intimidation, escalating routine stops into unnecessary arrests. The language of the complaints varied, but the core allegations were the same. They targeted people of color, using minor traffic violations as an excuse to escalate encounters. She clenched her jaw. This should have been enough to get them investigated, she said, her voice tight. Samira rolled her eyes. You know how it goes. Witnesses disappear. Internal Affairs finds a technicality to dismiss it, or the judge just trusts the officer's word over the victim's. Naomi's fingers tightened around the papers. Well, maybe this time will be different. Samira smiled, a hint of exhaustion in her expression. Maybe, but be careful. She tapped the folder. You have the credentials. You know how to navigate the system, but these guys, if they feel the walls closing in, they might get desperate. Naomi held her gaze. I'm counting on it. Naomi returned to her office at the Department of Justice, careful to keep a low profile. She hadn't officially disclosed her situation to her direct supervisors yet. She wasn't ready for the questions. She wasn't ready for the consequences of being a DOJ attorney under criminal charges, even if they were bogus. So she worked in silence, balancing her day-to-day caseload with the fight of her life. She knew what she had to do next. She needed to contact her own connections within Internal Affairs. She needed to see just how deep this corruption ran. And if Judge Caldwell or ADA Whitaker thought they could railroad this case, she had one final card to play. Her authority as a federal prosecutor. She wouldn't just defend herself, she would turn the tables. She would make this case bigger than just her. She would make sure the system couldn't ignore it. The weight of what was happening settled heavily on Naomi Carter's shoulders. The charges were bogus, the case was built on lies, but none of that mattered if the system protected the wrong people. Her supervisors at the DOJ still had no idea about her arrest, and she feared the moment they found out. They might pull her from active cases. Or worse, they might question her ability to remain unbiased. The very system she believed in could turn its back on her. Still, she couldn't fight this alone. So she confided in Jennifer Roble, one of her closest friends and a fellow DOJ attorney. Jennifer sat frozen, listening to every detail as Naomi laid out what had happened. When Naomi finished, Jennifer shot up from her chair and started pacing. "This is insane," she muttered. "These officers clearly picked the wrong person to harass." She stopped mid-stride and turned to face Naomi. "But you have to protect yourself. The minute they find out you're a federal attorney, this could escalate." Naomi nodded grimly. "I know." She had been thinking about that since the moment the cuffs nearly clicked around her wrists. "If I reveal it at the right time," Naomi continued, "it might scare them into dropping the case. Or it could open them up to federal charges." She hesitated. "But what if the judge dismisses me outright? What if his bias means I never get to make my case?" Jennifer folded her arms. "Then we file a motion to recuse him, or push to move this to federal court." She shook her head. "Naomi, you have the law on your side. If Caldwell tries to shut you down, the Civil Rights Division might step in." That thought gave Naomi a boost of hope. The DOJ had been taking misconduct more seriously in recent years. If she could present compelling evidence, maybe they would open a full-scale investigation into this precinct. She had no illusions. It could take months, even years, to see real accountability. But Naomi had never been afraid of a long fight. The next few days blurred together in a whirlwind of legal motions and strategy meetings. Stella filed a motion to dismiss the charges, citing contradictions in the police report, the bystanders' video evidence, past complaints against officers Brent Lawson and Daniel Grayson. Meanwhile, Naomi worked behind the scenes, tracking down witnesses. She finally reached out to the woman who'd recorded the viral video of her arrest, Kesha Brown. At first, Kesha was hesitant. "I don't want any trouble," she admitted over the phone. Naomi softened her tone. "I understand, but Kesha, this isn't just about me. These officers have a history of doing this to people who can't fight back." A pause, then a sigh. "Okay," Kesha said. "I'll help." Naomi met her at a coffee shop, where Kesha provided a sworn affidavit describing exactly what she saw. Naomi never raised her voice, she never physically resisted, she complied with every order. And then came the part that made Naomi's stomach twist. Kesha recalled hearing one of the officers muttering under his breath about Naomi being one of those loudmouths and acting above her station. The words weren't overtly racial, but the undertones were clear. Naomi clenched her jaw as she read it. She had felt that kind of prejudice before. In every glare, in every mocking smirk, in every moment someone had tried to belittle her accomplishments. She wouldn't let them silence her. The morning of the preliminary hearing, Naomi, Stella, and Marcus walked into the Bronx County Criminal Court, armed with sworn witness statements, past complaints against the officers, the viral video proving Naomi's compliance. As they entered the courtroom, Naomi felt the air shift, a mix of tension and expectation. This was the moment where she might expose these officers for what they really were. Or she might watch Judge Caldwell dismiss her case without a second thought. The question gnawed at her. Would he even consider the evidence fairly? Naomi took her seat at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly together. Across from her, the prosecution team sat, led by Caroline Whitaker. The DA's self-assured expression made Naomi's stomach turn. It was as if she already had the judge's verdict in her pocket. At her side sat Officers Lawson and Grayson. Their arms were folded, their expressions hardened, as if daring Naomi to meet their gaze. She didn't flinch. She inhaled slowly, reminding herself, this wasn't just about her. She was fighting for every person who had been silenced or discredited by officers like these. She would not lose her nerve. The clerk called Naomi's case, and Judge Caldwell swept into the courtroom, his robe flowing behind him. He cleared his throat, ready to begin. Naomi's pulse pounded in her ears. Whatever happened next would determine whether truth would finally see the light, or whether the system's bias would crush her, too. Caroline Whitaker was the first to step forward, her voice calm and methodical as she outlined the official police narrative. Your Honor, she began. The defendant refused multiple commands, acted aggressively, and impeded a lawful investigation. Whitaker's tone was measured, her language carefully crafted to paint Naomi as someone who had no respect for law enforcement. She continued, describing Naomi's alleged belligerence in exaggerated terms. Naomi's stomach twisted at the lies, but she forced her expression into neutrality. She would not react. Then it was Stella's turn. She stood, walking confidently to the podium. Your Honor, she said, her voice carrying through the courtroom, Miss Carter categorically denies these charges. She took a measured pause, then continued. We have video evidence, brief but crucial, that directly contradicts the officer's claims. Judge Caldwell lifted an eyebrow. Video evidence? He asked. From a body cam? No, Stella said, from a bystander's cell phone, posted publicly online. Whitaker immediately interjected. Your Honor, I would caution against relying on shaky, unauthenticated videos. We have official police reports, and these officers have clean records. We have no reason to doubt their credibility. Naomi clenched her teeth. No reason to doubt them? Her very existence in that courtroom was proof of why their credibility should be questioned. Judge Caldwell frowned slightly. I'll allow the video, he said, his tone neutral. But it must be verified. Then his gaze landed on Naomi. Miss Carter, how do you plead? Before she could speak, Stella answered for her. Not guilty, Your Honor. A hush settled over the room. Judge Caldwell scribbled a note in his file. Very well, he said. We will schedule a preliminary hearing to review the evidence. And just like that, the real battle was about to begin. The courtroom was still, the air charged with tension. On the screen, Naomi Carter stood beside her car, perfectly calm, as Officer Brent Lawson roughly patted her down. There was no aggression on her part, and yet, in the background, snippets of the officer's remarks could be faintly heard, low, sneering tones dripping with condescension. Stella paused the video, letting the silence stretch. Then she turned to Judge Raymond Caldwell. Your Honor, she said, pointing at the screen, you will notice that at no point do the officers issue clear, audible commands. The police report states that Miss Carter refused orders, yet there is no evidence of any such commands being given. Judge Caldwell leaned forward, peering at the screen with a flicker of something. Surprise, perhaps, before his expression hardened again. He clasped his hands together and gave a curt nod. Proceed. Stella called Kesha Brown to the witness stand. Kesha straightened her shoulders as she took her oath, then sat down, meeting Naomi's eyes briefly before turning to face the courtroom. Miss Brown, Stella began, can you confirm that you recorded the video we just viewed? Yes, Kesha said. And did you witness the entire encounter? Yes, Kesha repeated. I saw it from start to finish. Stella paced slightly. At any point, did you see Miss Carter resist arrest or obstruct the officers? Not at all, Kesha said firmly. She was calm the whole time. Stella nodded. Did you hear the officers say anything to Miss Carter during the stop? Kesha hesitated, then took a breath. I heard one of them call her a loudmouth. I don't know which one. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Naomi felt her stomach clench. She had known, deep down, she had known, that the officers had seen her as less than the moment they pulled her over. Now, it was in the record. Caroline Whitaker rose from her seat, the sharp click of her heels echoing as she approached the stand. Her voice dripped with calculated skepticism. Miss Brown, she began smoothly, could you have missed something while filming? Isn't it possible that Miss Carter resisted before you started recording? Kesha's expression remained unshaken. No, she replied. I started recording the moment I saw them pull her out of the car. She never struggled or yelled. Whitaker's lips twitched slightly, annoyed by the unwavering response. But you only captured a few seconds of the incident, she pressed. There could have been more, correct? Kesha didn't flinch. I watched the whole thing from across the street, she said evenly. She was calm the entire time. Whitaker pursed her lips. No further questions. Kesha stepped down. Naomi exhaled slowly, feeling a small victory settle in her chest. But the battle wasn't over. Stella stood again, this time holding a thick stack of papers. Your Honor, she began, I would like to introduce prior complaints filed against Officers Lawson and Grayson. Whitaker immediately objected. Your Honor, these complaints are irrelevant. This case is about this incident, not any prior allegations. Judge Caldwell frowned, clearly inclined to agree. Naomi's pulse quickened. If he struck this evidence, she would lose her biggest leverage. But Stella pushed forward. Your Honor, the pattern of misconduct matters. If these officers have a history of targeting civilians under similar circumstances, that is highly relevant to their credibility. Judge Caldwell hesitated. Then, begrudgingly, he allowed a limited discussion of the officers' records. A small victory, but not enough. Whitaker then called Officer Lawson to testify. He took the stand with an air of confidence, speaking in clipped, controlled tones. He stuck to the script. Naomi had been aggressive. She refused to comply. She made threats. Naomi's blood boiled. Then Officer Grayson took the stand and repeated the exact same lies. Naomi watched Judge Caldwell closely. He looked annoyed, but not necessarily with the officers. His irritation seemed directed at the defense itself, as if he was frustrated that they were daring to challenge law enforcement's account. Every time Stella objected, his tone grew sharper. Naomi clenched her fists beneath the table. He's protecting them. Finally, Stella stood once more. Your Honor, my client wishes to testify. Naomi inhaled sharply. This was it. She smoothed out her suit jacket, stood, and walked steadily to the witness stand. She refused to look nervous. Judge Caldwell regarded her with a hint of displeasure, as though bracing for an emotional plea. But Naomi wasn't here for dramatics. She was here to tell the truth. Under Stella's questioning, Naomi recounted the traffic stop with precision. She clarified that she had never resisted and that she had only asked why she was being searched. She described how the officers escalated the situation. Then came the cross-examination. Whitaker approached, her eyes cool and calculated. Miss Carter, she began, is it true that you question the officer's decision to stop you and conduct a search? Naomi nodded. Yes, I asked why I was being searched. She held Whitaker's gaze. That's not illegal. Whitaker's lips curved slightly. But you did speak back to them, correct? You didn't remain silent? Naomi resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Asking questions is not resisting, counselor. Whitaker's tone hardened. Isn't it possible that you were irritated and hostile? Perhaps the officers perceived your tone as threatening? Naomi took a measured breath. I used a calm tone the entire time, she said. Which is evident from the video. The officer's perception doesn't align with the actual footage. Then, Naomi felt a surge of adrenaline. This was her moment. She turned to Judge Caldwell. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady, there is additional context regarding my understanding of the law during that stop. Judge Caldwell raised an eyebrow. What context is that? Naomi lifted her chin, looking directly at him. I am an assistant U.S. attorney with the Department of Justice, Eastern District of New York. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Whitaker's eyes widened, momentarily stunned. Lawson and Grayson stiffened, exchanging stunned glances. And for the first time, Naomi saw Judge Caldwell hesitate. The power shifted. Naomi held his gaze. She had just dropped a bombshell. Now let's see what they do with it. A thick silence fell over the courtroom. Judge Raymond Caldwell's face froze, his usual impassive demeanor cracking for the first time. Across the aisle, officers Brent Lawson and Daniel Grayson exchanged stunned glances, their smug confidence evaporating in real time. Naomi Carter remained steady, her posture unshaken. She had just shattered their illusion of control. "I didn't reveal my position at the time of the stop," she continued, her voice measured but firm. "I wanted to avoid any conflict of interest or the appearance of impropriety, but I am intimately familiar with the constitutional standards regarding search and seizure." Her gaze swept across the room, unwavering. "I knew I was in the right, but I complied anyway." She let the words hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final blow. "Because I feared for my safety." The weight of that truth landed hard. "The officers were aggressive," she continued, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "They made demeaning remarks. That is the full truth of this matter." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even Judge Caldwell, usually unreadable, blinked rapidly, as if struggling to regain his composure. For the first time in the case, Naomi felt the power shift. The racist cops, the skeptical judge, the entire legal system that had tried to railroad her. They had just realized that the black woman they tried to silence wasn't merely a random defendant. She was someone who could dismantle their entire case from the inside out. Within 24 hours, the courtroom revelation sent shockwaves through the system. Internal Affairs took notice. The DOJ convened an emergency meeting. The NYPD found itself under intense scrutiny. Detective Brian Costello, previously hesitant to dig too deep, now had the political coverage he needed to go after Lawson and Grayson. At the Department of Justice, Naomi's supervisors, who had previously been in the dark, were now forced to acknowledge the mess unfolding in the public eye. They convened a special meeting, led by Assistant Attorney General Vanessa Castillo. Naomi sat across from Castillo in a private office, the tension palpable. Castillo, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, studied Naomi carefully over the rim of her glasses. "I've reviewed the court transcripts," she said, folding her hands over a thick case file. "This is a delicate situation." Naomi nodded, bracing herself. "Yes, ma'am." Castillo sighed, her posture softening slightly. "First, I want to say, I'm sorry you had to endure this," she said. "We take allegations of misconduct seriously, but you understand how complicated this is now, don't you?" Naomi's throat tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I do. When a DOJ attorney gets involved in a personal legal matter, especially one that directly implicates law enforcement, it puts us in a difficult position." A beat of silence passed. Then Castillo leaned forward. "That being said, the Civil Rights Division is reviewing your complaint." Naomi straightened slightly. "The prior complaints against officers Lawson and Grayson are also under review," Castillo continued. "And if we find credible evidence of a pattern of misconduct, this could lead to a formal investigation into the precinct." Naomi felt a surge of hope. "So, the department is taking this seriously?" Castillo nodded. "Yes. But Naomi, be prepared. This will get messy." Naomi took a slow breath. "I've never been afraid of a fight." Castillo studied her for a long moment, then gave a small nod of approval. "Good." Outside the courtroom, Naomi's entire life was upended. Once the court transcripts became public, the press swarmed the courthouse. Reporters flooded the steps, cameras flashing. News outlets smelled a headline. U.S. Attorney accuses NYPD officers of racial profiling. Naomi had never sought publicity, only justice. But in a media-driven city like New York, there was no escaping the spotlight. She ducked into side exits, dodged cameras, avoided reporters shoving microphones in her face. Still, the story spread like wildfire. And within days, it wasn't just New York talking about it. It was national news. The Blue Line Defenders, a pro-police advocacy group, rushed to the officer's defense, painting Naomi as a rogue prosecutor with a vendetta. Meanwhile, civil rights organizations demanded a full-scale DOJ investigation into the precinct's practices. Everywhere Naomi went, she could feel the weight of eyes watching her. She wasn't just a prosecutor fighting for justice anymore. She had become a symbol. In the days following the hearing, Naomi noticed a shift. Judge Caldwell, who had previously been aloof and dismissive, suddenly became measured. During a subsequent motion hearing, he referred to her as Counsel Carter. a subtle but undeniable acknowledgement of her legal authority. And at the prosecution's table, officers Lawson and Grayson sat with tightened jaws and stiff postures. Their smugness was gone. For the first time, they looked like men who knew they were losing control of the narrative. The case had exploded into something bigger than Naomi had ever imagined. The entire system, from the NYPD to the DOJ, was now watching closely. Her next move would be crucial. She had evidence, she had legal backing, and she had public support growing by the day. But the fight wasn't over yet. If anything, it was just getting started. The battle was far from over. Vanessa Castillo's words still echoed in Naomi Carter's mind as she left the DOJ headquarters. This will get messy. And messy it became. The local police union pushed back hard. Anonymous threats flooded Naomi's voicemail. Federal and local tensions were about to explode. But Naomi was ready. For years, she had been a prosecutor, tackling financial crimes, aiding in civil rights cases, but always from an institutional standpoint. Now, the very institution she worked for was being forced to scrutinize one of its strongest partnerships, local law enforcement. Naomi spent hours with federal investigators, meticulously detailing her experience. She provided the full video evidence, her own sworn statement, the complaints Samira Green had uncovered. Meanwhile, Detective Brian Costello ramped up internal affairs interviews. He spoke with Kesha Brown, the bystander who filmed the stop, other complainants who had accused officers Lawson and Grayson of misconduct, local witnesses who had witnessed similar abuses. And the truth started to unravel. Rumors spread that Lawson and Grayson were part of an informal clique within the precinct, one that had a reputation for targeting Black and Latino drivers to meet traffic stop quotas. They had gotten away with it for years. But now, their victims finally had a voice. Despite the growing evidence, Caroline Whitaker refused to drop the bogus charges against Naomi. Maybe she was afraid that doing so would confirm that the officers had been lying all along. Maybe she was trying to protect her own career. Either way, a court date loomed. The next hearing would be a pivotal moment where Stella Morano planned to present new DOJ findings, hoping to have Naomi's charges dismissed outright. But tensions were higher than ever. Naomi noticed her phone buzzing more frequently with unknown callers. Some were messages of support, others, not so friendly. "Drop the case. Stay in your lane, lady. You're making a big mistake." Marcus Ellis urged her to be cautious. "Naomi," he said one night, his voice low and serious, "people like this don't go down quietly." So she started, varying her daily routine, checking her surroundings more often, keeping her doors locked at all times. She refused to be intimidated, but she also refused to be reckless. The day of the hearing, Naomi sat beside Stella at the defense table, her fingers clasped tightly together. The courtroom was packed. The gallery buzzed with quiet murmurs as Whitaker took her place at the prosecution's table, her expression more tense than usual. Officers Lawson and Grayson sat rigid, their postures stiffer than before. They were no longer smirking. Judge Raymond Caldwell entered, his expression neutral, but Naomi could tell the pressure was mounting. Then Stella stood. "Your Honor," she began, "the Department of Justice is now conducting an investigation into officers Lawson and Grayson for misconduct." A ripple of surprise ran through the courtroom. Whitaker visibly tensed. Stella continued. "In light of these developments, combined with the inconsistencies in the police report and bystander video evidence, we respectfully move for all charges against Miss Carter to be dismissed." Judge Caldwell hesitated. For the first time, Naomi saw uncertainty in his face. He glanced toward Whitaker. Whitaker stood, gripping the podium a little too tightly. "Your Honor," she said, forcing her voice to remain calm, "Miss Carter's status as a federal attorney does not absolve her from the law." Judge Caldwell raised a hand. "Indeed, it does not," he said carefully. Then, after a long pause, he took a deep breath and leaned forward. "But given the serious questions raised about this traffic stop, I see no reason to proceed with these charges." Naomi stopped breathing. Caldwell turned toward her. "Miss Carter," he said, "I am ordering your arrest record to be expunged. There shall be no criminal record associated with this incident." His gavel came down. "This court is adjourned." A hushed silence followed. Then, the gallery erupted into a storm of whispers and hushed conversations. Naomi barely heard them. She felt Stella squeeze her hand under the table. Relief crashed over her like a wave. She had won. Within moments, reporters flooded the courtroom aisles, firing off rapid questions. Miss Carter, how do you feel about today's ruling? Do you think the NYPD should be investigated? Will you be taking legal action? Stella steered Naomi toward the corridor, shielding her from the flashing cameras. Once they were outside, Naomi finally allowed herself to breathe. She glanced up at the sky. The bright sunlight felt different today, like a welcome contrast to the weeks of looming darkness she had been living under. Marcus joined them outside, a broad grin on his face. "This is huge," he said, clapping Naomi on the shoulder. "They never thought this day would come." Naomi nodded, but her chest felt heavy. This was a victory, but it was also a reminder. Lawson and Grayson might face disciplinary action, but how many more like them were still out there? She looked at Stella. "We keep going," she said quietly. Stella nodded. "That's how you root out corruption, one case at a time." Within days, the police commissioner announced that Lawson and Grayson were officially suspended without pay. They would face an internal trial for falsifying records. Detective Costello had recommended they be charged with perjury. Meanwhile, the district attorney's office, still reeling from the scandal, was facing mounting pressure to prosecute them or risk further public outrage. For Naomi, the victory was bittersweet. She had exposed two bad cops. But this wasn't just about them. Racist policing wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much deeper issue. Still, Naomi had proven one thing. With unwavering resolve, the right resources, and a refusal to back down, justice could prevail. And this fight was only beginning. Naomi Carter sat in her dimly lit kitchen, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands. She stared at the screen of her phone, scrolling through the day's headlines. DOJ investigates NYPD officers in false arrest scandal. Suspended cops facing possible perjury charges. Is police accountability finally here? Each article dissected her case, the officers' misconduct, and the larger fight against racial profiling. Naomi exhaled, feeling exhaustion settle deep into her bones. The battle had been grueling, but a spark of hope burned in her chest. She had walked through the fire and emerged, not unscathed, but stronger. She would never forget the humiliation of being searched in public. She would never forget the fear of being thrown into the system she had sworn to uphold. But she had fought back. And now? She had proven that the system could be forced to work for justice, if pressured hard enough. Maybe this was just one victory. But if the system could be pushed to protect one innocent person, maybe, with continued pressure, it could protect many more. Naomi was more than willing to keep fighting, because sometimes karma needed a helping hand, and she would gladly provide it. A month passed since the charges against Naomi were dismissed. She returned to her normal duties at the Department of Justice, but life was anything but normal. Her case had ignited a firestorm. Community groups rallied, holding public forums on racial profiling and police reform. Naomi received invites to speak, and though she wasn't a public speaker by nature, she accepted when she could. Standing before crowds of concerned citizens, she shared her story. She made one thing clear. She was not anti-police. She was pro-justice. Some in the crowd were skeptical at first, but by the end of her speeches she could see it in their faces. Conviction, determination, hope. The applause and cheers only strengthened her resolve. One afternoon, Naomi received an unexpected request. A meeting with the attorney representing officers Lawson and Grayson. She sat across from him in a quiet conference room, arms folded as he cleared his throat. "Miss Carter," he began, choosing his words carefully, "my clients are willing to accept disciplinary measures if you drop any pursuit of federal charges." He shifted uncomfortably. "They claim they never intended for this to escalate the way it did." Naomi felt a cold anger coil in her chest. Now they were sorry? Now that they were facing real consequences? She tilted her head. "That's not how accountability works." The attorney hesitated. Naomi leaned forward. "I don't control the DOJ's decisions on federal charges," she said calmly. "The department will decide based on the evidence." His expression fell. She could see the desperation in his eyes. He pleaded for leniency, but Naomi offered none. "Apologies could have happened at any time," she said coolly, "but they falsified reports. They tried to ruin my life. She shook her head. Now it's too late for a quick escape. The attorney swallowed hard. He knew she wasn't backing down. A week later, the departmental trial concluded. The verdict came down swiftly. Officers Lawson and Grayson were fired from the NYPD. The internal panel recommended that the DA file criminal charges for perjury. The city erupted into heated debate. Some people cheered, calling it justice. Others raged, calling it a witch hunt against police. Naomi didn't care about public opinion. She knew the truth. This wasn't about one case. This was about a broken system that needed accountability. And real justice required continued vigilance. The day after the verdict, Naomi stood on the steps of City Hall. A sea of reporters filled the street, cameras zooming in as she stepped up to the microphone. Her voice was clear, steady, unwavering. This was never about personal revenge, she said. This is about ensuring that the law applies equally to everyone, regardless of race or rank. I have respect for the many good officers who serve our communities. But we cannot tolerate abuse of power. Her voice grew stronger. We must hold bad actors accountable to protect the integrity of law enforcement and the safety of all citizens. Her words were broadcast across the country. News outlets picked up her speech. Talk shows debated her case. Social media exploded with conversations about policing and reform. Lawmakers hinted at drafting new oversight legislation. More people began filing complaints, no longer afraid that their voices would be ignored. Naomi had never asked to be a symbol. But now, she was leading a movement. Through it all, Naomi remained dedicated to her work. She didn't chase fame, she didn't grandstand. She quietly returned to her DOJ caseload, all while pushing for policy reforms at every level of the justice system. She collaborated with civil rights groups, forming alliances that extended beyond New York. Her case had become part of a larger fight, a tapestry of resistance and reform. And she wasn't done yet. One night, Naomi sat alone in her apartment, the city lights flickering outside her window. She sipped her tea, staring at her phone. A notification popped up. "Your case inspired me to come forward, thank you." Naomi set the phone down, staring at the steam rising from her cup. She thought back to that fateful morning, when she was just an ordinary citizen behind the wheel. She remembered the fear, the anger, the violation. But she also remembered something else. The spark of resolve. The determination to fight for what was right. She had been tested, and though the scars remained, she had emerged stronger. Naomi Carter had faced the system head-on, and she refused to back down. The fight was over, for now. Naomi Carter had won her case, but her battle for justice was far from finished. She knew that real change never came from a single victory in court. But sometimes, it started with one. Sometimes, the most profound movements were born from a single injustice that could no longer be ignored. And now, her fight had become bigger than herself. It was about every person who had been silenced. Every individual who had been afraid to speak up. Every victim of a broken system who deserved justice. Naomi held on to the hope that her journey would inspire others, that when faced with adversity, people would remember her story and realize that the law, when wielded correctly, could be the most powerful weapon for good. Naomi Carter, the unassuming black woman who two officers thought was just another helpless driver, had stood against injustice and emerged as a beacon of hope. Her fight had never been about revenge. It had never been about personal glory. It had always been about something greater. Proving that no one, no matter their race, status, or station in life, should be silenced by the very system meant to protect them. And as Naomi continued her work at the Department of Justice, her story resonated through neighborhoods, courtrooms, media outlets across the nation. It became a reminder that truth, when backed by determination, could shatter even the strongest walls of corruption, bigotry, and bias. If you found power and inspiration in Naomi's story, don't let it stop here. Share it with those who need hope. Spread awareness. Stand up for justice. Because real change doesn't come from one person alone. It comes from one voice, one story, one step at a time. This is only the beginning. Meet Naomi Carter, a poised, intelligent black woman who seemed like an easy target for two racist cops. At first glance, they thought she was just another motorist they could bully and frame. But little did they know. Behind Naomi's calm demeanor lay a fiery resolve. and a devastating secret that would turn the tables. She was a U.S. attorney. This is the story of how Naomi fought back against corrupt officers, against a biased judge, against a system that tried to silence her. Prepare for shocking revelations, explosive courtroom battles, a soul-stirring triumph that would echo across the nation. Buckle up, because justice is about to be served.